Welcome everyone to the CAQ's webinar in partnership with NACD. I'm Vanessa Teitelbaum. I'm very, very pleased to be joined today by three speakers who will introduce themselves in a moment. Before we get started, we are providing one CPE credit. And so I'm sure you're familiar with the drill. There'll be polling questions. You'll need to respond in order to get that CPE credit. Our program is 60 minutes today, and we're going to focus on audit committee effectiveness, specifically priorities and composition. So to get us started, I'd like to welcome Theo Bunting. Theo, can you give a brief intro of our audience today?
Sure, Vanessa. Good afternoon, everyone, and glad to be with you today. As Vanessa said, Theo Bunting. I spent pretty much my entire professional career with Entergy Corporation, retired in 2017. Currently serve on the board of three publicly traded companies, Unum Group, Hanover Insurance, and Nisource, which chair the audit committee of Nisource, serve on the audit committee of Hanover, and served on the audit committee of Unum Group for 5 years when I initially joined that board. Again, glad to be here with you today, and hopefully we'll have a great conversation.
Great, thank you. Sara?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sara Lewis, and I'm thrilled to be here today with my fellow panelists to discuss audit committee effectiveness. Over the last 19 years, I've served on 8 public company boards and 2 private boards. I've chaired 5 U.S. and global audit committees, and I currently chair the audit committee of Weyerhaeuser Company, and I'm a member of the audit committee of Freeport-McMoRan.
Thank you. And both Theo and Sara are on the CAQ's Audit Committee Council, and they have been for over 2 years, and we appreciate their contribution to us and our work. And lastly, I want to introduce Krista Parsons from Deloitte. Krista and I worked together on a survey on this topic that was published in January of this year. It was our second report. So Krista?
Yes, thank you. Great to be here with everybody. So Krista Parsons, I'm a managing director within Deloitte Center for Board Effectiveness, and I lead our audit committee programs across the firm. So I spend all of my time working with audit committees and directors on a wide range of governance topics. I've been with Deloitte for about 23 years, and I've been focused exclusively in the governance space for about 10.
Awesome. So you can see we have some great experts today. So we're going to start with our first polling question to get a sense of who is on the webinar with us. So we're going to watch that now. And the question is, what role do you serve in? So whether you're on a public company or private company audit committee, some other committee other than the audit, C-suite, management outside C-suite, or none of the above. And we'll wait for those results. While we're waiting for those results, we're going to go to our first question. And we're going to start with Sara. The question is, what do audit committees have on their agenda for 2023? And that's obviously a broad question. The reason we want to frame this, and we'll talk more about the results of our report, the joint report that I just referred to. Because we want to focus on priorities. And so we want to know, Sara, in your experience, what are you focused on from an agenda perspective?
So at my companies, cybersecurity is always top of mind for the audit committee, even when oversight occurs at the board level. We generally get more frequent updates at the audit committee. We ask more questions about evolving risks, and we discuss any specific incidents as they occur. We also expect the SEC's new cyber rule to come out this spring. ESG reporting and the upcoming climate rule from the SEC is also a big area of focus. My companies already do a lot of sustainability reporting. So at the audit committee level, we want to know that the data disclosed are accurate, supported, and auditable. I expect that internal audit will play a bigger role in providing assurance over this data. And of course, the new SEC rule on climate will have a lot of additional requirements. Then, of course, there are the traditional areas of focus. Financial reporting, internal control over financial reporting, the coordination between internal or external audit and internal audit, as well as the management team, and then the ever-evolving use of technology by my companies and their auditors.
Thanks. Before Theo, I go to you. Is it possible, let me see if we can launch our polling results. Here we go. All right, so we've got, I would say, spread across the board, which is great. We're happy to have so many different constituents and stakeholders joining us. Sarah, before we go to Theo on the same question, I'm going to throw you a question from our audience, which is, where is geopolitical risk in your scope of responsibilities? And maybe to add on to that question, how does that factor into your agenda?
So geopolitical risk would fall into your enterprise risk management process, right? And so that would generally be discussed at the board level. It might, depending on your company, it might hit non-gov if geopolitical risk is a really big risk for your organization. But it would generally be talked about at the board level as part of the enterprise risk management process. That's how I see it.
Thanks. Theo, can you talk about your agenda and maybe also respond to the question from the audience about geopolitical risks?
Sure. I'll do the question from the audience first. From my perspective, it's very similar to Sara. Our ERM framework is really the way it's structured within the company audit committee I chair. The audit committee is responsible, its primary responsibility for ERM and ERM governance as it relates to the board. Clearly, the various risks that are identified through the ERM process are disseminated across the board as it relates to oversight. So geopolitical risk, probably one we would identify as a headline risk today. And, again, would probably fall more with nom and gov, could fall in other areas depending upon the specifics as it relates to when we talk about geopolitical risk, what are we really talking about? So that would be my perspective on that question. Again, not much different from Sara. As it relates to, kind of what are we focused on? Again, not much different from the items Sara mentioned, but I'll maybe take a different twist. When I started 2023 as audit committee chair at Nisource, when we started the 2023 year, I took a step back and said, hey, how effective is our charter? Do we really have a good charter? And as part of that process, we set out to benchmark our charter and worked with one of our panelists, actually, Krista Parsons with Deloitte. And we benchmarked our charter and really to help define, our areas of focus. And as we did that benchmarking, it highlighted certain areas that we felt were important that we should focus on. Because from my perspective, your charter really should drive your agenda. And as we did the benchmarking, we set our agenda for the year. And the areas of focus, again, not much different than Sara. Cybersecurity, enterprise risk management, the ESG disclosure and reporting, your typical audit committee agenda items, internal audit, your engagement with your external auditors. But what we also stepped back and said, how much time are we devoting to these topics? And are we devoting adequate time to the topics? So not only did we look at areas of focus, but we looked at how often are we focusing on these areas? Are we are we looking at them the right way? For instance, on cybersecurity, are we bringing in outside experts to talk to the committee and the board about cybersecurity? And should we be doing that? The answer obviously was yes. and so, it not only did it help us set kind of our focus, but it also helped us set focus in terms of, how often and how much time should we devote to these specific areas.
Thanks. I think that's one of the crux, and Krista, I'll come to you next, about one of the reasons we do the survey, and it's just one data point because there's so many different perspectives, but I think trying to understand how committees and boards are prioritizing and how they're thinking about the composition to address what you're saying is what we're trying to get data on. We have a lot of good questions, which we'll come to in a minute. But Krista, can you talk similar to Sara and Theo, the result of our report and also what you see? I know you do so much work with boards.
Yeah, absolutely. So I didn't ask, I should have asked beforehand if Sara and Theo had filled out our survey, because what they are saying is in line very much, as you know, Vanessa, with what we saw in the results of our survey.
Encourage them to do so.
I know, exactly. So I think, so the results are similar, but let me give you a little bit of the data behind it, just to give you a sense of some of the numbers we heard, and just a little bit of background on the survey. As Vanessa said, this is the second year we did this. We asked priorities, we asked processes around audit committees. We also asked a little bit about composition. So as you think about priorities, and I should say also that all of the respondents were audit committee members. So we did hear directly from audit committee members as it relates to everything that we're going to talk about with respect to the data. So first thing I would say is that it was consistent with last year, and that most of the priorities that we heard last year are the same as what we heard this year. Not surprising to probably anybody on the line, nothing really fell off the audit committee's plate, but we do continue to see things expanding, or that scope creep that people often talk about. And it's interesting just to understand what's changing. As you know, I meet with audit committees on a regular basis to see what's changing. So as Sara mentioned, I think in her comments, there's a lot of the things that are consistent, a lot of the core responsibilities that have to still remain: financial reporting, controls, oversight of internal and external audit, compliance, risk. So some of those things that are at the heart of the audit committee. The three top areas we heard beyond financial reporting, because we asked specifically beyond that, what are the three things that you think your audit committees will be focusing on over the next year? Number one was cyber. We had 63% of the people that were surveyed said that cyber was in the top three focus areas for the next year. And a third of the group said that that was the number one area. One of the questions I get all the time is it really the role of the audit committee, or should it fall to another either committee or to the board? And what I see, which I think is consistent with what Sara and Theo have said as well, is that most often I do see that it falls to the audit committee if there is not a risk committee. But because it is such a significant risk, it's so core to an organization that there is usually some sort of report out to the board, at least annually as well, because the board has to have some sort of insight into that. The second area that was the second highest focus area beyond financial reporting was enterprise risk. And that was 45% of the respondents said that was in the top three focus areas for the year. We asked who oversaw that, and over 40% said that the audit committee had primary oversight for the enterprise risk program, which is consistent with what I see, that audit committees tend to oversee the program, which is the process that the organization uses to identify the key risks, where then once those risks are identified, those may be allocated across the board and the different committees. But that process and that program is typically overseen by the audit committee in our experience. And then the third area, which was also mentioned, was ESG disclosure and reporting. With everything that's going on with the SEC and the climate rule that's expected any day now, we had 39% that said that would be in the top three areas for the next year. And we did intentionally this year split out that question. So we asked about ESG strategy, and then we asked about disclosure and reporting. So number three area was disclosure and reporting. But what I thought was interesting is that the next group that was listed as overseeing that was the board. And what I think that suggests is that companies are still trying to figure this out. And even when I talk to boards or when I talk to audit committees, they are trying to figure this out about where does this fit, because we do see that it's spread out. And as companies are trying to grapple with who does what in the ESG reporting area or just ESG broadly, I think we will see some evolution, but I do think the audit committees will increasingly play roles with respect to this, especially as you think about the disclosure area and the reporting area as it relates to ESG. So those are the top three areas that we saw in the report from the audit committee members that we surveyed.
Thanks. Let's do our second polling question if we can. We'll launch it now, which is asking you as the audience if this is applicable outside of financial reporting and internal controls. And we say that because when we ask if the top three priorities, financial reporting and internal controls is typically number one, and we think it should be. So beyond that, what are the three areas that you anticipate the audit committee, whether you're on the audit committee, you interact with the audit committee, will be focused on over the next 12 months? And we'll see how that matches up with our results. And that will also contribute to your CPE credit. So let's see those results in a little bit. I have another question from the audience. We talked about cyber being one of the top areas of focus. And so the question is, I just lost it, but let me find it. Now we have a lot of questions. So I think that, here it is. With as much as the audit committee has on its plate and the escalation of cybersecurity risk, what are your thoughts on establishing a board committee specifically focused on this and other IT issues? And this comes up a lot in our discussions, whether it's cyber or some other topic. Should you have a standalone committee? So I know what we hear a lot of the times. I don't know if Theo or Sara, one of you wants to go first. Either whether you have.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I'll take a shot. You know, it's obviously something that, as you said, it comes up often, and it's something that has come up in the context of, you know, audit committee meetings. And when you talk about the time and amount of, you know, kind of what the audit committees have on their plate, I agree with that. I mean, there's a lot of things that, you know, it seems it just continue to add things to our plate. But, you know, one thing that we try to do is be effective with the time that we have and try to manage our agendas, you know, really well. But, you know, so when you say, gee, should we have another committee, where would that stop, right? You know, how many committees do you add for quote unquote specialty items? And when does it become so unruly that, you know, you can't manage it? So I think my response to that is, no, I don't necessarily see it a special committee. Clearly, it needs to get the focus that it needs from the audit committee and the full board as well. And I think it's really up to audit committee chairs to, you know, to manage, to really do really good time management as it relates to audit committee meetings and be very effective within the context of the meetings, which means, you know, focus on preparation, focus on presentation, and focus on discussion and conversation, and make sure you really are focused in hitting on what's really important within the context of the meeting. I spend a lot of time outside of the meeting with presenters, you know, making sure and ensuring that they're prepared, making sure the audit committee members are prepared. We have transitioned to more of, you know, we don't want presentations from management and outside individuals we bring in. We want discussions. I have a rule, quite frankly, my audit committee meetings, one slide for every 3 to 4 minutes of time you have on the agenda. That's it. And so it's really about, I think, really being efficient and effective. And if you do that, I think you can manage this kind of this evolving dynamic agenda as it relates to audit committees.
I agree with everything that Theo said. I mean, managing your agenda and managing all of the pre-work that you do ahead of time with the committee members, as well as management and external audit and internal audit. There's a ton of work that goes into every meeting well ahead of that meeting to make sure that it goes well and that you can handle your agenda well. In regard to forming an extra committee, I also agree with Theo on this topic, unless it's a company that has really specific issues where cyber is just absolutely important. And then, you know, as it relates to financial institutions, that cyber often ends up in the risk committee. So they often already have a risk committee, and then cyber will end up there. And so that then it comes off. It's still, you know, something that's very important to audit committee. And in my case, when I was on a global insurance company, we would have some joint meetings with risk on cybersecurity in particular, just so that we were also informed. But every company is different. So I think you need to do what's best for your company.
Thanks. Okay, let's see if we can launch the results of our polling question to share with the audience. So cyber is number 1, ERM, and ESG. All right.
Hey, validated the results.
But there's a lot, you know, there is certainly a decent percentage for these other risks too. And they're also important. So thank you guys for sharing that. So our next question that we thought about in preparing for this discussion is evaluating the makeup of the audit committee and thinking about the skill set needed. And there's some questions from the audience about, how do you gain the expertise that you need? How do you succession plan or bring in expertise as you need it? So Theo, can we start with you in terms of how you mentioned your charter already, but how about the composition and the skill set of the committee? And as that's evolved over the years, how do you manage it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question for me because in May of last year, my entire audit committee, for whatever reason, transitioned off the board. One moved to another committee to actually chair a different committee. So I lost three audit committee. I lost my entire audit committee. But it was an opportunity actually, because as we look to onboard, new board members and kind of refresh our board, I went to the chair and the Nom and Gov committee and said, hey, I've got gaps in my audit committee. I don't really specifically have audit committee members today. As I look across the landscape of my board, I'm not sure, we have the skill matrix that I'd like to see within the context of my audit committee. So we specifically, as we went to refresh the board, we specifically looked to folks with a certain skill set that would be able to bring them into the audit committee and function and really enhance, our skill matrix and capabilities of our audit committee. So we actually brought two new folks on the board, one a licensed CPA, the other actually had audit committee experience, public company audit committee experience, and actually currently chairs an audit committee of another board. So we bolstered our skill set from audit committee basically through the board refresh process. Another way to look at that is just through committee assignments. I mean, typically each year the boards I'm on, we step back, the Nom and Gov committee steps back and it kind of looks at, should we be changing committee assignments for board members? Is there something we learned that says, hey, maybe this board member, and even board members get the input into that process themselves. I'd like to serve on a different committee or have an interest in this committee. So that's another way we look at it. We also, pretty much every board I'm on today does a skill matrix that's in your proxy statement. And so you have an opportunity to see, kind of where your gaps are from a skills perspective. And clearly some of those skills relate to audit committee expertise. The third area for us is we do an annual evaluation on the audit committee. And some of the questions in the evaluation basically say, do we have the right skill mix? Do we have a gap? Do we need to add members maybe that have a different skill sets? And so, probably 2 or 3 ways we kind of tend to refresh the matrix, refresh our committee in terms of makeup of the other committee. Today, we have 3 audit committee financial experts on the board, the audit committee board that I chair. And we have another individual who is financially literate, but has a different background, which for me is interesting because what I found is board members who maybe don't have the deep skill set ask really good questions and provokes a lot of thought, quite frankly, for us. Some of us who we're so deeply, we have so much knowledge and we're deep. Sometimes we maybe take some of these things for granted and just assume. So, having that diversity and actually having a board member who may not be an audit committee financial expert, I think is helpful.
Thanks. Before we go to Krista, we did have posted a link to the report that we are referring to in the chat. If you're looking for that, you can also Google it and find it on our website. It's the Audit Committee Practices Report. So Krista, how about for you in terms of, what you're seeing in the companies that you work with for skill set assessments?
Yeah, I think everything Theo said, I would completely agree with. I think the matrix, the skills matrix, we talk about it a lot in the context of boards, but thinking about it in the context of the audit committee and making sure that the audit committee chair is involved in the conversations about succession planning as it relates to the chair themselves, plus the rest of the committee members, I think is important. And especially as you think about the evolving risks and the evolving things that the company may be dealing with. So really identifying what is it that the company, whether it's strategy, risk, what is it that they're facing, and do I have the right skills on the committee to be able to address those those items going forward. So I do completely agree with the skills metrics and keeping that fresh. I also think from an education standpoint, making sure that it's done. I think there's a responsibility for the board and the committee members as a whole. So trying to free up time or allow time somehow on your agendas to have education, whether that's done during the meetings. And that can be as simple, I say simple, I know it's hard to free up the time, but bringing in, a business unit leader, a geography leader to talk about their business, to talk about the risk, talk about the challenges they have, just to help keep the directors fresh and keep them knowledgeable. Bringing out an outside expert to talk about it. It could also be done in an outside off-cycle meeting. I do think the world of Zoom now that we are living in many instances, I think that's opened up opportunities where before the pandemic, we didn't see a lot of these, phone calls where a board would do something like that. But nowadays, it's easier to schedule an off-cycle meeting to have some expert come and talk about a topic that's interesting. So I think that's helpful for the board or the audit committee itself, but then also taking that upon yourself as an individual. So getting on the conference circuit, there are great programs out there. I know NACD has a lot of great programs. Deloitte has some great symposiums and webinars that you should attend or could attend, publications that are out there. And then I would say too, using your network. I find that a lot of the best knowledge is from networking with yourselves and talking to your peers and hearing what each other is struggling with and how did you deal with a certain topic. So just really trying to stay fresh from that perspective, I think really helps keep you fresh as well as a director.
Thanks. Sara, do you have anything to add on these points?
I agree with everything that Theo and Krista said, and I can't add any more. But I fully believe in continuing education, and it is our responsibility to do it both in the boardroom and outside the boardroom on our own. So it's absolutely a responsibility that we should take advantage of the many opportunities out there to get continuing with.
Yeah, thank you. So this dovetails into our next topic, which is, it's related, right? Which is expertise. And we talked already about whether or not, we talked a little bit about whether a board should have a cyber or an IT or a tech committee. There's some other questions. Sometimes sustainability comes up. One thing, and I feel bad saying this because it might be super obvious, but it just sort of was an eye opener for me, which is when you have a new committee, there's not new members on that committee, right? You're pulling from the board. So establishing a new committee is just rearranging things. So it's really about whether if you need to add expertise to the board and then the board delegates down to a committee. So when you do, so that's why we talk a lot about the skill set matrix and successor planning, and Sara, I know you talked before about in our conversations, that's a limited number of seats that has to fulfill a lot of responsibilities. So that makes me ask about expertise. When you think about that, what I'll call precious board seat, how do you think about tackling having the expertise that you need either for specific topics like we've been talking about? And if you don't put it on the board, how else does the audit committee, gain the expertise that they need? There you
go. So, again, you have to keep that skills matrix fresh. And I think, so you do committee and board evaluations every year. And I think you gain insight into how the committees and the board are operating. So that helps inform what you need to do to be most effective going forward. And then you should always have everyone review that skills matrix every year. And then you need to have a discussion together, either at non-gov or as an entire board, and go over it and really think hard about what you need going forward. And you also need to have effective evaluations throughout the boardroom, because there are times when people, get stale or it's not a priority for them anymore, or, and so you can, if you have a strong chair and a strong non-gov chair, you can have a conversation with a certain board member and say, hey, we need you to either, step it up, or maybe it's time for you to think about rolling off, and then you can make room for another person with more modern skill sets who has more time to devote to the board. And so you tackle it from a lot of different directions, through the evaluations of the committees and the board, through evaluation of individual board members, which can take many different forms, through keeping your skills matrix up to date and really having a forward-looking view on what you need going forward. So you tackle it from many different angles.
Thanks. Krista, can you talk a little bit? We asked some of these questions in our survey. Can you talk a little bit about our results?
Yeah, I think one thing that was interesting, we asked about just anticipated changes to the audit committee. You talk about that a lot, I feel like, in the board, at the board level, but I don't really see data out there at the audit committee level. And if just at the surface, the number may not look that surprising, because I think it's like 60, 70%, that no, there's going to be no changes. But if you flip it, it was about a quarter expected change in the composition of the audit committee. And that's, if you think about it, that's a decent number of changes over the next year. And we asked about it in the context of the chair, and we asked about it in the context of the committee members. So that's a decent number of changes that the folks that took the survey expect to make over the next year. And I take it as a healthy sign, because I think, as Sara said, your strategy may be changing, your risk may be changing, and the really great board member of 5 years ago may still be a really great board member, but maybe just not for your organization. Maybe they are better served in a different organization just because the strategy, the risks have changed, and you need somebody with different skills. So I think constantly thinking about what are those skills, what are the experiences that we need at this point in time to deal with what we're dealing with today and to take us into the future, I think is something that's really important as you think about these new risks that are coming down the road. So really thinking about that and kind of going back to that matrix and making sure that matrix is assessing, what do we need today? What do we need in the future? And then matching that up against your directors, I think makes a lot of sense. So it'll be interesting to see if we see that number of turnover in the audit committees over the next year or not. But I'm kind of taking that as a positive sign that audit committees are looking at what do we need for the future and maybe thinking about it in that context.
Thanks. Theo, can I go to you next?
Sure. I really don't have much to add. Krista and Sara, I think have really covered this well. The one thing that I would say that I think is important is for audit committee chairs to really be self-reflective in terms of, thinking about, things that we see coming, in terms of new disclosures, in terms of new rules potentially, and really be self-reflective and be very transparent with themselves and say, do I have a committee that has the appropriate skill set to deal with these things? And if the answer to that is, I'm not certain, then I think the next question is, do I need to have it? And, is there a way to get it other than quote unquote changing the composition of my committee? This was mentioned before, bringing in outside experts, right? To have conversations with the committee about some of these particular areas. The one thing that is done on a couple of boards that I'm on, we talk about the evaluation process. We go as far as to actually give feedback to the Nom and Gov chair about other board members. And we get to critique each other. And that information is brought back to us as board members in terms of how we were critiqued. And we get feedback as to, how other board members think about us and how we're functioning. And so I think, if you have a really strong evaluation process within the context of your board governance, and you're giving board members open, honest, transparent feedback, you really understand where your skills, and you do your skill matrix, you really understand where your gaps are. And it really helps. The other thing that I'd say is, I think when I've been in conversations with folks about this topic of, expertise, this isn't static, it's dynamic. And if you find yourself chasing expertise, I think you'll find yourself fundamentally pulling your hair out. As you can tell, I've done a little bit of that because I don't have very much. Because, how do you manage that? How do you manage that? And so I think what's important, and I've heard this conversation in a number of different forums, is, really work your skill matrix, understand where your skills gaps are, but then be reflective of how important is it really to get this level of expertise. And if you really have good board members who have strong business, have strong backgrounds, and are very broad, I think the key to any board and its effectiveness is you've got a questioning board. You've got a board that says, hey, I don't understand this. I need you to explain it. And so you could have the conversations around these different areas and really focus in on them. You know, sometimes I think the generalist, quite frankly, can add more value than a specialist in a lot of areas. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox.
Thanks. Now, I think we've had in my discussions with various audit committee members, you know, I've heard that before, which is kind of interesting because in some of the SEC proposals, there is questions and thought. It looks like they're leaning towards the possibility of requiring certain expertise on the board. And I think in our response and others' public comments, you know, there's sort of pros and cons to that. So I think it's the, you know, access to the expertise that's critical, whether it resides on the board as a board member. I think there's some pros and cons to think about from a public policy perspective. We're going to go now to ESG reporting. Hopefully we're not hashtag ESG fatigue, but just because it's hard to have a webinar without it, we have the SEC climate rule that we are thinking it's going to be coming out soon. And so, Krista, you referred to it before. Companies are spending a lot of time considering where this is going. So, Krista, we asked some questions about ESG in our survey. So, can you talk about what we are hearing on this front?
Yeah, so as you said, we're still waiting for the final rule from the SEC any day now. So the thing I would say though, because we get so many questions, and I know you said, you know, hashtag ESG fatigue. I think, you know, as we wait, the thing I always tell audit committees, and I think many of them are in the same boat, is that regardless of what comes out, investors are asking about it. Investors continue to ask for disclosures in this area. So I see most audit committees are taking this seriously, and management as well. And so that there's a lot of work that's happening in the audit committee space, and just from companies in general. And so from some of the stats that we heard in the survey, about a third of the people that we surveyed said that they have somebody on the audit committee with some sort of ESG or sustainability expertise. We see when we do research that the broad ESG oversight tends to fall to the Nom/Gov committee or to the board, most often Nom/Gov committee. But as I'd mentioned earlier, the audit committee is definitely starting to play a bigger focus or a bigger role in this area, specifically when you think about metrics, controls, disclosures, and you think about some of the things that are kind of SOX-like, that are Sarbanes-Oxley-like. And so 4 areas I would just quickly highlight where we are seeing audit committees think about this and getting the finance organization, getting internal audit involved. One around metrics and internal controls. So audit committees just trying to understand what are the metrics that are out there, what are we publicly disclosing in a sustainability report or elsewhere on a website, some other filing, anything that's out there, what is out there? And for anything that is out there, what are the metrics? Where is it coming from? Is it in a spreadsheet? Is it in some sort of general ledger? Where is it coming from? And what are the controls that are in place? Because some of the data that is included in some of these ESG disclosures are not your typical financial data that may be having these more robust controls around it. So getting an understanding of that, what are the metrics, what are the controls? The second one is understanding how the ESG related disclosures compare between everything that's out there. It hasn't been unusual in the past to see a disclosure or a sustainability report have something and then a website have something different. So understanding if there is different information out there, and if so, why, and should it be different or should it be the same? There have been comment letters from the SEC about this if they've seen different disclosures in different places. The third thing I would say is to understand if there are any assurance related activities going on, or if not, why, or should there be? So what is the company doing as it relates to assurance? Are they thinking about that? And then the fourth one I would say is just thinking about the connection between the ESG strategy and then any impact that may have on the financial statement. So there are instances where the strategy and things that management may say could have a financial impact. And so the audit committee would want to just understand that if there are things that are being put out there, there are goals that are being set publicly, how that could potentially impact the financial statement. So those are 4 areas that I would say that I see audit committees focusing on today as we're waiting to see what that final rule will say down the road.
Thanks. And we have a question from the audience. So if you're not familiar with the SEC's proposed rule, we're referring to the proposed climate rule, and we're expecting a final rule they have on the regulatory flex agenda. It will come out in April. I'm raising my eyebrows because there was thousands and thousands of comment letters if you haven't been following it. And so I'm slightly skeptical of coming out, but it's just one gal's opinion, not an official CAQ view. Theo, can you talk about ESG at your companies, the boards that you're on? And I appreciate ESG is broad. E is very different from S, is very different from G, and E is broad as well. And it's not necessarily just climate, but we do tend to squish them all together. And we know it's been evolving, this topic and the expertise that you need, as Krista was referring to, and as we conducted some questions in our survey. So can you talk about your journey and your experience?
Sure. I'll probably highlight some of the things Krista mentioned as well. One of the boards I'm on, we took an interesting approach. We basically said, here we did a matrix and said, here are the elements of ESG as we think about and know about them today. And here are the various responsibilities, if you look at charters of the various committees of our board, and whether they intersect. And do we have, just based on as we see our charters today with the various committees, can we map the various elements of ESG in terms of how we think about it to responsibilities with various committees on our board as exists today? And where we had gaps, we stepped back and said, and this was done really under the kind of auspice of the Nom and Gov committee, because both of the boards I serve on are really all 3. Generally, the lead around ESG sits within the Nom and Gov committee or a similar committee. And as we identified gaps, we said, okay, geez, where should these specific areas where we have gaps as we see our charters and our committee responsibilities today, where should it reside? And, we went through that process and said, okay, now if it should reside in audit committee, then we need to change our charter to reflect the fact that that responsibility resides within the context of the audit committee. And so that was the process we went through, and we kind of refreshed that on an ongoing basis, because as you know, some of the specificity in terms of so what is it, what are responsible around ESG is it'll evolve, right? And I think what you typically saw within the context of the audit committee is a lot of things that Krista talked about: disclosures, assurance, and are we comfortable that from an internal controls perspective, we've got the right controls in place as it relates to ESG responsibilities. What I would say overarching all of that is how you think about ESG. And, we think about it generally from kind of a risk management perspective. And is it properly incorporated within the ERM process? And how is it linked with the context of our ERM and how the board is managing the risk enterprise as it relates to the company also. So it continues to evolve. One of the things that I worry a little bit about as it relates to ESG is getting ahead of it. So we have tried to stay on top of it, but not get ahead of it, because as you said, the rules supposedly on climate will come out in April. I'm not sure everybody fundamentally believes it'll happen that quickly, and so we have taken action within the context of management to start preparing ourselves. But again, you don't want to get ahead of it because you don't know exactly where it's going to go. So
thanks. We haven't lost track of our polling questions. There's been 2. We've got 2 to go. So we're going to launch our 3rd polling question now. Keep everybody honest for your CPE credit. So do you have a process in place to regularly assess the experience and expertise of the audit committee? We'll share the results in a minute. And while we wait for the results, Sara, can you talk about your ESG journey, if you will?
Sure. So, my companies have largely been reporting on sustainability issues for quite some time. And so my ask of them has generally been around making sure that that data is really strong, in whatever form it exists, whether it's on a website, whether they issue a sustainability report. I want those numbers or that data to be as tied down as an earnings conference call, as an earnings press release, non-GAAP numbers, anything that, that is not necessarily audited annually by the external auditors, but still numbers that investors may rely on, right? So I want that all tied down, documented, and then in my companies, I think, are in various forms of having internal audit, test these different areas to make sure that they're exactly what they say they are. And so I think that's really important. And then I have my 3rd company where I chair compensation. We've been compensating the executive team. We have I think it's 15%-ish of their short-term incentive is based on whether or not they meet established ESG metrics, and those are E, S, and G. And so we've been doing that for 2 years. We're into our 3rd year on that, and we've changed those criteria as the world evolves and as expectations evolve. So I think that's an area that will continue to expand for a lot of companies.
Okay, great, thanks. Let's see what the results were of the poll, if we have them. Awesome. So 35% yes, which if I were to cull out the 40%, that percentage would go up, but I can't do the math that fast. So, for the 25% who said no, I think we might suggest that's something you consider, periodically on a more formal basis. We do have a question from the audience about sustainability. If I can find it. Which I cannot really quickly, so I'll come back to it in a minute. We have one last topic to discuss, which is on fraud. And the reason we want to talk about that is because it actually didn't pop as a top agenda item, which is maybe not bad if it's a more mature risk assessment, there's mature controls, maybe it's not of a concern compared to emerging issues. That's one theory that we have. And so we asked ourselves, are audit committees spending enough time on fraud? It seems like a benign topic until it's not. So Sara, I'm going to start with you in terms of, how your boards that you're on think about the risk.
Well, we obviously take fraud risk very seriously, and we discuss it every quarter with our external auditors. The good news is that technology in both internal audit and external audit is allowing for exponentially larger sample sizes to be tested than could have ever been done in the past. And so the technology used by internal audit and external audit will likely result in fraudulent transactions being found much more quickly than before. So that's the good news. The bad news is that when someone deliberately sets out to commit fraud, it's still very hard to find. So it's something that is never ending, and we always have to keep our eyes out for it.
Theo, can you expand on this? This is not one of the questions we prepped on, but I think we talk about the risk of complacency. And so, is that something you face in your experience? And if so, how do you overcome it?
Yeah, to answer the question directly in terms of is it something audit committees are focusing enough attention on, my response is yes. And I mean, I think absolutely you have to. But again, as Sara said, sometimes it's hard to detect, it's hard to find. But, you know, I think the conversations we have really are more around the changing environment. Is the changing environment increasing the risk of fraud? You know, when you think about virtual, you know, kind of virtual work environments today, and for me also just, you know, the macroeconomic environment, you know, high inflation, high interest rates, the need to want to continue to demonstrate, you know, value and you know, kind of, you know, looking at focusing on total shareholder return within the context of management. And so are we in an environment now from a risk profile perspective where, you know, maybe the, you know, the folks' views and thoughts around fraud and maybe their willingness to do things that may, whether they're nefarious or not, do things might kind of push the envelope as it relates to fraud is something that I think audit committee should be focusing on, and better understanding, do you have good internal controls in place to monitor activities in these respective areas? You know, when you're looking at earnings releases, you know, how deeply are you looking at them? Are you thinking about what are we saying to, you know, from a public disclosure perspective around releases? How is management really, the culture? How is management really talking within the context of the company around the importance of, you know, achieving commitments as it relates to, you know, the financial markets? And so, you know, really kind of dialing in and really talking with internal audit. I mean, I actually met with an internal audit group last week, one of the companies I'm on the board of, and said, you know, I really need you to help me better understand the climate in the company today. And you know, what are you seeing when you're out there performing your internal audit work? You know, are you seeing a different change as it relates to potentially the culture? Are people feeling more pressured as it relates to, you know, various elements of their responsibilities? And if so, that's something you need to bring back to us as audit committee members and make us aware of that, because that could be pointing to, those could be leading indicators of things to come. And, you know, as audit committee chair and audit committee, we want to stay on top of those things. So I think, you know, given this macroeconomic environment, just given, you know, many companies are in a constant state of change, digital transformation, you know, are we seeing people maybe acting differently than they've acted in the past? And so if so, you know, we need to understand it. We need to have a conversation about that within the context of the audit committee.
Krista, anything to add?
Just a couple things. I agree with everything that Sara and Theo said. And then the couple things I would add is just to really understand. First, I would say I do think that audit committees are taking this seriously. And I think to your point, Vanessa, that it is something that it's just always there in the background, right? It's always there in the back of audit committees' minds as they're talking about the financial results. So kind of as we think about the results of the survey, that's the way that I looked at it. But from an audit committee standpoint, I think it's important to understand what are the anti-fraud programs that management has in place to deter and detect fraud. I think it's important to understand that and understand how those are communicated throughout the organization and how are those part of the ethics and compliance programs that they have. The other thing I think to think about is, what is the whistleblower program and how is that communicated throughout the organization to other stakeholders outside of the organization? You know, I've worked from time to time with companies that will say, you know, our whistleblower program is great, we don't get any calls. Well, I would tell you it's probably terrible if you get no calls, because you're always going to have an innocuous report that, you know, someone looked at me the wrong way or somebody said something weird to me, you know, that is maybe nothing. So you really need to understand, have good programs, understand what's coming through. And yes, you need details, but you also really need to understand trends. Are there certain business units, certain geographies, certain executives, certain complaint types coming through, and really thinking about it from a fraud perspective. And this is where internal audit can be really helpful. You also want to understand broadly what internal audit's doing from that perspective, and then also understanding what your independent auditors are doing for their fraud risk assessment. So those are a couple other things that I would add from an audit committee standpoint.
Thanks. And I mean, all of this is, you know, tied together with culture. And I will make a quick plug. We do have an anti-fraud collaboration. It has a website, antifraudcollaboration.org, with some resources related to fraud fraud or anti-fraud, and especially on culture. So you can check that out. We're going to do our next polling question, which is back to ESG. Is your audit committee or the responsible committee engaging outside experts other than company management to learn? So while you answer that, I am going to flip quickly to the question I was trying to look for before, which I found. And so, Sara, I'm going to ask, direct this to you in just a minute or two, and then we'll wrap up. The question is, I was asking about the survey that we did, but in your experience, are sustainability reports validated, internal audit, external audit, other, before being published? And I will say we have on the CAQ some data on this, which I'll put in the chat, on the S&P 500 and what assurance and who companies are getting assurance from. But can you talk a little bit about your experience with validation?
Yeah, I mean, it's evolved over the years, right? So at the beginning, I would say there was probably not a lot of assurance happening. Weyerhaeuser is a huge expert in terms of sustainability. So I might say that their assurance would be as good as anyone externally. So again, every company is different. And so they're looking at different things, but a lot of companies are getting assurance, at least on, scope 1 and scope 2 emissions for sure. And then I would say less assurance, or maybe it's internal assurance from internal audit on some of the other data points.
Okay, great. Let's launch the results of our poll for the audience's benefit and for ours. So 29% are engaging with experts, and 28% no, with 42% saying they don't know. So, it'd be interesting, Krista, if we do this again over time, we can see how that might be trending. Yeah. Before we wrap up, one thing to ask the audience: if you have suggestions for future webinar topics, we'll do this webinar quarterly. Put them in the chat. We'll have a record of it, and we will love to give it consideration. So with that, let's do our round the horn key takeaways for the audience. Theo, let's start with you.
Sure. I know we're getting close on time, so I'll keep this very brief. The key take, and I'll give you one. The key takeaway for me is, I think, around relationships. I mean, we talked about a lot of things today. We're in an ever-evolving area when we talk about audit committee responsibility. And I think today it's more important than ever to have really good communication, open, transparent communication relationships between management, audit committee, internal auditors, external auditors, because it's, as we go forward and we try to tackle some of the issues, some of the areas we talked about today, it's going to require close collaboration and work among those groups. I think in order to get it right, in order to have an effective audit committee function, in order to have effective audit committee meetings, in order to effectively transition to maybe new responsibilities, new disclosure, so on and so forth. So I really think now more than ever, it's really important to maintain good working relationships within the context of all of those groups.
Thanks. Krista?
I would say, I think, everything we've talked about today, I feel like somehow relates to risk. And when I talk to audit committees, I always talk about thinking about your agenda in the context of risk and using that to prioritize what you focus on. So instead of just repurposing whatever it was you talked about last quarter or this quarter last year, think about it through a risk lens. And if it's something that's not on your risk agenda today or in the near future, then maybe it shouldn't be there. And then I'll throw out one specific risk, which we didn't even touch on today, and it's probably a little broader than audit committee, but it is coming up so often, is AI. It's just
a question about that. Sorry, we didn't get to it.
Yeah, it is just, it's constant. And I can count on one hand, maybe, the number of boards or audit committees that have actually asked about it, because I think it's so new and it's pretty scary. And I think that it's here and boards should be asking about it. So I'm just going to leave that there. Okay, that's thanks. A whole other topic.
Yeah, maybe that'll be a new next webinar. And Sara, round us out.
So, I agree with everything that Krista and Theo said. And And yes, Theo's absolutely right about relationships. They are absolutely key to having a high quality audit. So I couldn't agree more. And the last thing I would recommend is just read. Like everyone on the audit committee, like you need to read business news, industry news, analyst reports. You know, the big four accounting firms, Deloitte, you know, they have great resources, as does NACD. So take advantage, as I said earlier, there's numerous board education events out there to stay informed. And I just think that's really crucial.
Great. Well, I am sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but we'll have those for future consideration. And we thank you all so much for joining us. And a special thanks to Sara, Theo, and Krista. It's been a great discussion, and we hope to see you on our next NACD CAQ webinar. So have a great day, everybody.